Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome to today's episode of Arba'een Reflections. Today's episode is on spiritual gains. It's on a very practical spirituality, which in the tradition of the Ahlulbayt and of the religion of Islam is not something which is so extreme that we cannot attain spirituality. Rather, in our lives today, we can find the means to live a spiritual life. But the question then is, where does it come from? From what do we form this spiritual life? Who gives it to us? And what does it actually mean to be spiritual in the West? Because this term is used quite disparately. But the way the Imams lived and the way the Quran speaks about spirituality is a very clear lifestyle. And so we, the listeners, would like to attain a portion of that. And to have this discussion, we are joined by two fantastic guests. First, we have Sh.Muhammad Khani, who is a student in Qom for over a decade and from Denmark. And he works very much with the local community in Denmark to teach the youth and the community in general about the true teachings of Ahlulbayt and of Islam, and is working very hard in the West. And we have Sister Dr. Amina Inloes, who is an academic, a PhD, a teacher and a writer. And she has a new book, in fact, coming out, which she has been working on Imam traditions of Ashura of Imam al-Hussein, which is coming out quite soon. And she joins us too to provide her insight, and her intellectual and academic background supports her, and her engagement with the community. And her upbringing also helps her very much to speak on this topic with myself and Sh.Muhammad Khani on the topic of spirituality. It's practical and it's something which we need to know how to implement in our own lifestyles. Let's begin, inshallah. When we use the term spirituality, that can mean a range of different things based on different cultures. It seems like even non-Muslims have a view of spirituality, or they use the term to describe something. And so often it's hard to know exactly what we're speaking about when we say spirituality in the Shi'i tradition. So, Sister Amina, when we are using this word spirituality, in its technical sense, what are we speaking about? What is spirituality from the Shi'i tradition?
That is a very good point to begin with. I think you hit on something important there with the introduction, in that the term spirituality does seem to be rather modern, and it is generally a word in the context that we're using it right now that's come from the modern West. And I think that's probably because of the modern split we have in the quote-unquote secular world between the material and the spiritual. And that if you go back a few hundred years to a lot of societies, east, west, north, south, etc., you do find in general in these societies there was more of a holistic view of creation. That is to say, a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of the importance of the human being, a sense that the human has non-material dimensions as well as obviously material dimensions. Whereas one can say one of the main transformations that European-style modernity eventually brought to the world, because it didn't happen immediately, but basically by the 20th century, was this idea that the most important thing is that which is tangible, and we're not exactly quite sure about the things that aren't tangible, but they're not really worth talking about. So I think it's only because of that split that we actually have the word quote-unquote spirituality. Now, I did give it some thought before this discussion, and I still can't quite think of an exact term that we have in our tradition for spirituality. I would say Irfan is the closest, which is knowing. We do have a strong emphasis on the ma'rifah of Allah, even in the early texts. So perhaps the inner experiential knowledge of Allah and knowledge of higher realities and realities about the existence, the soul, and creation, and so forth. I think that would probably be the closest thing that we have to an inherent quote-unquote spirituality in the classical Shi'i tradition. That being said, I don't think we should discard using the word spirituality, because we are living in a world in a lot of places, not just heavily secularized countries, where there is a very strong split between the material and the spiritual. So it is important sometimes to use words like this to be able to pinpoint what is missing and to help people fill in the gaps.
Beautiful, thank you so much. So now we have a context of the material and the immaterial, in which we're trying to understand which fits into which category. And it seems like spirituality is very much concerned with the immaterial. Sheikh, now when you look at the tradition that we have, do you see this emphasis on the immaterial in our spiritual tradition?
Yeah, but we don't divide it, just like the sister she mentioned, we don't divide it in the material and the immaterial, like the spiritual. Actually, like the whole concept of seeking closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not something that is divided into spirituality and into the material. We actually are using this world, or the means that we actually have in this world, to reach the higher goal, and that itself is a some sort of spirituality. So it's not like Islam is demanding that we are, what is it called, refraining or staying away from the material, but using it, this material world as a mean. That's why we have a beautiful hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he states that ad-dunya mazra'atul akhirah. Like it's like a, what is it called? Like you have to harvest for the afterlife, for the hereafter, in this world, in the material world. Because there was an individual who came to him and told him that he was tired of this world, the material world, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told him that don't be tired of this material world. It's only an introduction for the next life, for the hereafter. So we don't separate between the two, and we see that seeking closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as spirituality, but it's not something that is divided or not, what is it called, or separate from the material world. Like this is a sister mentioned, like in different parts of the world, uh, where they're separated. And in Islam, we don't do that. There's no separation between the two.
Yeah. I wonder, because when we do phrase spirituality too much about the immaterial, like we focus too much, it becomes almost like an impossible thing to attain. It becomes,
Yeah.
the language is so abstract. It's so like you have to retreat from society and you have to live this very aesthetic life. And it seems like we're making it harder for people than it really is. Why are we doing this?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some basic things that can improve our spirituality, because spirituality in Islam, within Islam, is seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you can do that by like some simple means or actions throughout your daily life. Some, for example, sincerity in your intention, focusing on your prayers, for example, having discipline in your prayers, being focused in your prayers. A concept like tafakkur, contemplating, for example, over your existence, why you're here. So it's like simple things. If you have a discipline doing these different actions throughout your day, in your daily life, it's going to be very easy to actually reach that kind of spirituality that you should be seeking, instead of that new age spirituality where it's all about feelings. But if you look at the traditions from Ahlulbayt alayhi salam, from Imam Baqir alayhi salam, if I'm not mistaken, there's a beautiful hadith where he states that our actions should be repeated like with discipline throughout two years or more than that, before you can actually see the fruits of that action, before you can see the effect of that action. Because a lot of youth, unfortunately, they think that having spirituality, you can attain it without actually sacrificing. And that's the main issue that we actually have amongst a lot of youth, that they think that without sacrificing, you can reach some sort of spirituality and have that feeling within you. But that's simply not true. Like Islam is about sacrificing, right? And when you do it with a greater purpose, you actually understand why you're doing it. You start contemplating over the greater cause and why you're here, your own existence and the purpose of life. So going back to your question about the whole abstract thing, that spirituality is just some sort of feeling, like an immaterial feeling, and something that is very like far out, and you can't really reach it. That's simply not true. You can do it by just the simple actions that we have within Islam, by being focused and disciplined and contemplating over why you actually are doing these different actions or different deeds that is obligatory within Islam, such as the prayer, the fasting, and so on and so forth.
The emphasis on discipline is very important, and you mentioned it a couple of times. It's as if the Shi'i the spiritual path has very clear practical tips of what we should be doing, and clear steps towards a very clear goal, which is ma'rifah of Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, this discipline, Sister Amina, what is it composed of? What are the actions or requirements that are practically part of this path to Allah from our discussion?
Well, I think one of the first good things to look at is the overall value of discipline before getting to specifics, although the specifics are very important. As you were discussing just a moment ago, the human being is composed of both body and soul. Some scholars would say that even in the barzakh and the hereafter, we are to some degree still composed of body and soul, just a different sort of body. So we can't get away from the fact that we are not entirely composed of soul, and therefore there's going to be an interchange between the body and the soul. If a person's body is not functioning in the sense that they can't speak, they can't walk, etc., they're not going to be able to translate what comes from the soul to other people. It's going to remain with them personally. And similarly, as we all know, usually we know what we experience or do to our bodies, whether it's actions or what we eat or substances or just how we take care of ourselves, sometimes our basic health. And that also either it affects our ability to interface with higher spiritual realities, or it could have some impact on the soul, including a long-term impact. Can I scare people?
Please.
We all know that in the akhirah, the hereafter, it said that when we do deeds in this life, they become manifest in the next life. So, for example, someone who is eating people's wealth unjustly might have a giant belly protruding, or even be like a pig or something like that, and so on and so forth. So we don't see the realities of deeds in this world. This is one of the aspects of a heavily materialist worldview, by the way. People might say ethics is relative entirely, or morality is entirely relative, because these things don't have a objective reality. But in our worldview, they do actually have an objective reality that becomes manifest in the hereafter, even though most of the time we can't perceive it in this world. It said people like Ahlulbayt and so forth used to perceive these things clearly, but in general, we don't see them in our day-to-day life. So in that regard, there is a interchange between the body and the soul. So if we are disciplining the body, it's going to have a corresponding effect on the soul. Now, before I lecture people on the importance of saying their prayers on time, I'd like to point out that this can really extend into a lot of areas which are also recommended in Islam. A lot of times, sometimes we just focus on the prescribed, jurisprudentially prescribed acts of worship, which are very important. But as we know, Islam is holistic. So in general, you can say having a disciplined lifestyle to the extent of one's ability can aid in the development of one's spiritual connection, perception, and realization, and just remove some of the noise in the same way that sometimes our internet connection is not very good and we have noise. So, for example, if you want to take something like salat, the salat in and of itself is a very disciplined act. That's one of the main effects it has on people, apart from connecting them to God. If you actually pray your prayers on time regularly, or most of the time regularly, it does make you much more disciplined than someone who doesn't have an equivalent discipline practice. Especially, let's be honest, the Salat al-Fajr. I mean, I used to think about that sometimes back when I went to high school. Most of the other kids in class are not getting up at dawn to pray. Now some of them are. I had a Buddhist friend whose family used to make her do that, but many of them are not. And that discipline is something that carries out in your day-to-day life and also affects you spiritually. But adding to that, if someone is genuinely taking this very seriously, they're not just going to jump into the salat. They might make sure the area is very clean, that their clothing is very clean, that they haven't been stuffing themselves with crisps and chocolates and, fizzy drinks and stuff, because it's going to affect their brain. They might probably not going to get into an argument with someone right before the salat. Afterwards, they're likely to be a bit calmer. So this sort of discipline can extend beyond the actual rituals themselves. That's what I'm saying. And that in of itself can have a very transformative impact on a human being, both in terms of their daily life and also in terms of their spiritual interfacing.
Sheikh, I just felt very targeted by some of those points. Thoughts? What are your thoughts, Sheikh?
That's a beautiful point. Actually, one of the things that he would tell his students when it came to spirituality or being focused in the prayer, used to give them some sort of exercise where he used to tell them that they should sit for 5 minutes every single day outside the prayer and focus on one certain thing. And when they start thinking about other things, they should quickly rewind to that thing that they were thinking about in the beginning. So they focus only on one thing for 5 minutes in a row. And after a couple of years, one of his students were practicing this. He came back to him and he asked him, so what was the reason for actually practicing like this specific exercise? He said, but because if you're not able to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout your day, it's going to show in your prayers as well. If your biggest worries throughout your day is always your material affairs, your worldly affairs, it's going to show in the prayer as well. As soon as you say your takbiratul ihram, you start thinking about what kind of groceries you should buy. I hadn't done my homework. I have to go to work. I have to pick up the kids. My wife is calling me. You know, who is it that send me a text, for example, on my phone and stuff. So you start thinking about your worldly affairs directly because you're not disciplined enough to actually concentrate when it comes to the prayer. Or throughout the day, you're not focusing on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many recommended actions, which is not directly related to the prayer, but if you combine it and you look at it from a bird perspective, as we say in Danish, like from above, you can actually see that it's related to the prayer somehow. They say when you wake up in the morning, start in the name of Allah, for example. A simple Bismillah, just make it a habit for yourself. When you're going and brushing your teeth, are you actually doing for the sake of Allah, right? Like simple basic acts. If you're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then your prayers will be much more concentrated and you will be able to have focus in your prayers because all the different actions throughout your day, you're disciplined and trained enough to actually combine it to the greater purpose, which when you stand in prayer, then you'll be like, this is the purpose why I'm living, right? Because when I brush my teeth, I do it for the sake of Allah. When I go to school, I do it for the sake of Allah. When I, for example, pick up the kids, when I bring something for my wife, I do it for the sake of Allah. Then when you stand in prayer, you'll be like, this is actually the reason why I'm living, right? Because now you got time only to focus on that. It's not mixed with other things, brushing teeth or anything else. So you're taking all the other actions out, but the concentration is still there. The contemplation is still there. You're still focusing on the greater purpose of life. So that's a beautiful point that the sister actually mentioned, that when it comes to the prayer and outside of the prayer, the different actions outside of the prayer, the impact it has on the prayer itself, to have this discipline and seek that spirituality so we can focus on the greater purpose of life. That's a very beautiful point and valid as well.
This is also a beautiful point about our spirituality in general. Every action has the potential to become sacred, because
definitely,
even if it's not a overtly religious act, when other people define it, brushing your teeth or hygiene or all these things have their own spiritual
simple
benefit.
actions, yeah, definitely.
And like, so that makes the entire lifestyle religious. And so it's as if we're using the term religious wrongly sometimes.
Definitely. And sometimes it's not even like, it's not even us coming up with these things. It's not like we're inventing these things. No, we have it in the narrations, right? It's something that, like, if you look at the different recommended actions from Ahlulbayt, just to give you a simple like example of how raising your child, for example, to be able to, what is it called, like cut the cell loose from the attachment to the worldly affairs. They say that when your kid grows up, when it becomes 5 years old or something like that, you give the money to your kid and let them pay the sadaqah, for example, the what is it called, the money for the poor. You let them pay for it. So if you do that throughout a couple of years, of course, this child is going to be like trained to actually give out from its own wealth, right? It's going to be disciplined enough to actually do it. So when you're telling them when they become mukallaf, now you have to pay khums, now you have to pay zakat, now you have to pay these different things, they're not going to be like, oh, I don't want to do that, because they don't have that strong attachment. They're actually trained and disciplined enough to actually do it. So sometimes it's not only the different actions that we define as ibadat, but actually a lifestyle that defines whether we're going to have that spirituality in our life or not.
Yes, that's a very beautiful way of putting it, and a very good reminder about child raising as well. I do think that's definitely one of the ideals of our tradition that we see, for example, in the portrayals of the prophets and the imams, to have constant remembrance of Allah and see everything in that light. And I do think that is, in general, one of the goals, if you will, of spiritual development, to reach the point that one is continually conscious of Allah, and also one understands that whatever one is holding or using is a creation of Allah, not just a thing that people built or something that I bought or was given, and that people are creations of Allah. That can be particularly challenging sometimes, especially
Yeah,
with certain people. But I think there's also some very specific challenges to that in this day and age. I think one of the, I mean, okay, I wasn't alive back then, but I'm guessing, I think that one of the effects of the Industrial Revolution and the workday schedule that we have since then, or we had into lockdown anyway, the sort of 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 factory-ish style, even if you're not working in a factory, it does very much impose a spiritual material divide, and it really pushes you more into the material mindset, unless perhaps your job involves something that might, it might have some, it might be involving some characteristics which are reminiscent of the attributes of Allah, like if you're in a heavily caring profession, for example. But for many of us, it really can eat away at the spiritual sense. And so I think sometimes a bit of extra effort can be helpful in sacralizing secular space, if you will, and finding ways to integrate those times into a more spiritually and materially holistic lifestyle. And I do think, incidentally, this is one of the things that a lot of people are recognizing right now, just how healthy a more, for those of us who have the privilege to work from home at least, how healthy a more holistic lifestyle is, that as a matter of fact, putting people into factories, whether literally or metaphorically, it does certain things for society and for production and the economy, but it doesn't necessarily do things for the human being as a whole, or the family, or the community. And it would be good to try to evolve into other ways of being that are more supportive of the various aspects of the human being. I mean, not everyone might be phrasing it that way, but I think that's something a lot of people are feeling right now, regardless of their faith background.
Yeah, and the good thing about this distinction is there's a difference between the natural inclination of the human and the societal context of the human. Because now we might have a natural desire for spirituality, but that might be nothing to do with the environment in which I'm in. Sheikh, you have studied in the East, but also in the West, and you are experiencing both. In this climate we're in now, it's as if the system does not want us to have that spiritual world, or
yeah,
there are certain barriers to it which are part of where we live. It's not coming from us.
yeah. Looking at the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the things that we notice that, which unfortunately a lot of people they have a tendency to neglect, that one of the parts of his life, or one of the things that he focused a lot when he immigrated from Mecca to Medina, was getting influence in the society. So instead of actually focusing on masajid, focusing on giving spiritual lectures and all of these things, he actually pointed out people to take care of this political interest, the social interest of the people. Because he knew from the beginning, if we can organize a society in such a way that it's easier for people to focus on the greater goal, the greater purpose of life, spirituality is going to be something that is going to be easy to actually attend. Like for the individual who actually seeks spirituality, it's going to be available for him. It's not going to be difficult for him, at least, right? That's why you see that there was clear rules that he put for all the Muslimin. The first thing he did was he said that everybody who converted to Islam, it's obligatory for him to stay in Medina and to live in Medina. So the people that converted to Islam were not allowed to actually live outside of Medina. He said, no, you're only allowed to live inside Medina. That's it. Because he wanted to strengthen the bond between the Muslimin and organize a society in such a way and design it so it actually becomes easier for the individual to seek that spirituality, instead of the Muslimin or the individual who actually believe in a greater purpose of life are divided and live different areas, like they're not together to actually reflect their ideas and their beliefs, and you know their whole purpose of living. They can reflect it with each other, like just by being present. So that was one of the things that he did. So it just emphasized on the importance that we actually try to create that environment within the Muslim communities where we live, as the sister mentioned, because it is very difficult in a Western country to actually have that. But alhamdulillah, now what I've seen, thanks to the youth we have in Denmark, for example, and the jihad they've been doing in Denmark, of course the spiritual one. I mean, nobody's gonna get arrested for this one, but
we don't say the J word ever anymore.
okay, yeah, okay. Striving for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Which word, Sheikh? I don't understand. Which word?
Striving for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The youth, they actually created this environment for a lot of people where they can feel, well, it's easier for them to actually attain that kind of spirituality. So after the university, for example, they meet up and they talk about different things that are actually related to the greater purpose somehow, right? It's about serious issues. It's about actually developing as a Muslim community, what kind of issues we have. And so it's our responsibility as Muslims to actually create that society within a society. So people, they actually have that alternative, because if they don't get it in their schools, if they don't get it in their universities, at the work, factories, jobs, and stuff like that, the only place that are left is the masajid, the mosques, the different Hussainiyat, the Islamic centers. And if if you don't have a congregation that is strong and the bond is strong between the mu'mineen, the believers in that congregation, it's not going to have it's not going to be appealing, especially not to the youth. So it's very important to find some youth, to encourage them to be active, to create that society within a society where individuals, they can come and feel free, and where spirituality is actually available for them in a secular country. Because here in Iran, it's very different. Everywhere you go, you have these signs and symbols that remind you of the greater purpose of life. In school, for example, when we hear adhan, the classes are finished, right? So you're constantly reminded of the greater purpose in life. In the universities in Copenhagen, for example, it's not like that. It's not like somebody's like reciting adhan every time your class is finished or when you have to pray. So you have to have a lot stronger discipline. You have to be more disciplined, like the sister mentioned. But if you're a group and there's a jama'ah, then it makes it very easy for you to actually keep up with the spirituality and keep up with the discipline, because that's one of the benefits of having this congregation. But like, just to give a practical example, throughout the year, many of us, we find it very difficult to actually fast throughout the year, right? Even though there's a lot of days that it's very recommended to fast, but subhanallah, as soon as Ramadan kicks in and it becomes Shahr Ramadan, you see that we don't have any issue fasting like 30 days in a row. And that's one of the blessings of having a congregation that are strong. You know psychologically, you know that 1.5, 1.7 billion Muslims, they're celebrating these days, right? You know that Muslimin, I know there's a lot of Muslims not fasting as well, but you know that there's a lot of Muslim fasting as well. And you eat together, you have iftar together, and the believers, they sit together, you know, there's more focus on spirituality. And that's one of the beautiful blessings of having this community and society within a society. So if we just focus on strengthening our bond to other believers in the society, connecting, networking with other believers in our society, I think that gap which a secular society creates when it comes to spirituality, we can fill that gap out with having this relationship with other believers.
I really like this methodology of society within a society, because people often say things like, you know, how do you know that a 1400-year-old society is relevant today? You know, today we're in such a hostile environment. How can we implement that society internally here? And the answer is, even when the Holy Prophet did all of his hard work, even that was within a hostile environment. And so
yeah,
we are like adopting the same techniques in our lives. I like this approach very much.
Yeah. Exactly.
Definitely, and I would agree that although in many ways spirituality, well, one can say there's a bit of a paradox. Spirituality in some ways is based on the individual relationship with that which is beyond. So, for example, the Quran mentions that we come to Allah as individuals in the hereafter, which is an interesting thing to say given how communal and tribal the Arab society was, or to a large degree still is. I don't think the concept of the individual really had much currency then. And yet there's a reminder that at the end of the day, it is between you and Allah. At the same time, I think in any of the world's traditions, both spirituality and religion are human disciplines that have been transferred person to person, as we used to say in our tradition, from chest to chest. This is how all the Islamic sciences actually got transferred, as we know, whether it's the hadith or other ijazas. Also, the spiritual learning is done from person to person, generally speaking, face to face, because there is a sort of there's a verbal transfer of knowledge and there's an immaterial transfer of knowledge, and I'm of the view that some of that does happen on a level that we can't necessarily see, but you are impacted if you spend a lot of time in the presence of someone who has a very high level of faith or a high level of understanding. Ethics is another subject that is very difficult to teach theoretically. I mean, we only have to look at how many religious lectures there are out there about gossiping. You know, who listening right now has not heard a lecture about gossiping? Unless you're new to the community or new to listening to these things, I'm sure you've heard it. But the words what to do go in one side of the brain, and what the human being does happens somewhere else. So as people, we tend to learn through modeling and other forms of transfer, in addition to the intellectual knowledge, which sometimes helps to sort that out. But the point being, that has been traditional, and yet I do think that is one of the challenges we have today. And I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. This is not going to be a lecture about why don't you go to the mosque. Well, a lot of places are locked down right now anyway. However, because of the advantages of the internet and globalization and so on and so forth, one of the disadvantages is sometimes we've lost this person-to-person transfer of aspects of our heritage, including the spiritual transfer of knowledge, which might have been much easier in the past. I think even, dare I say, given that I did grow up in the non-internet age, it was even a bit different back then. And so this is something that is valuable that I do think we should keep in mind. And also, of course, the aspect of communal worship, as the Sheikh was saying. Many of our acts of worship are group-based, and this also, it's different. We know it's different. If I recite Ziyarat Ashura at home, it's not bad. It's a very good thing, but it is different if I do it with a large group of people, and we can feel it even if we can't always put words in why. So both are important, but definitely the communal aspect is very important.
And this, if anything, stresses the dynamism of spirituality, that it can be, has its own function for the individual, as it does for the community, as it does for the entire, the qawm in general, and even in interfaith relations as well, like it becomes very significant. But in terms of how it affects the individual, you make a good point, because some of us are locked down, some of us are in quarantine or no longer having access. It means that we have to reevaluate where we obtain our spirituality from. Is it from the mosque, or is it from me, or my access to the sources? Like, where does it come from? Sheikh, when you speak to young people especially, do you stress this point, that where do you get your spirituality from? Where do you get that motivation from?
Yeah, of course, I try to mention it because it's very important that it's not limited to the masjid, because you see that throughout the history of Islam, it was not limited to a masjid, to a certain place. That's why you see that the imams are buried in different places. Imam Qadim alayhi salam, he was even in prison for many years. But as the name itself, Qadim al-Ghayth, he was one of the most spiritual of all of them. Like, he used the time for seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while he was in prison. So it's not limited to the masjid, and we shouldn't, of course, limit it to the masjid. So we should only see the masjid and the community and all these things as a mean, not the actual purpose, And unfortunately, there's individuals, when they see that there's a strong community, for example, they join just because, like, they want some, associates or something like that, networking. It's not about the greater purpose. But in general, I think that having a strong community that it helps you doing that, having that spirituality and maintain that spirituality. But now, because of lockdown, of course, it's limited and it's difficult. And that's one of the things I told the youth as well. This is a good opportunity to actually find out how disciplined we actually are when it comes to Islam. If we see that the different actions that we used to do on a regular basis, going to the masjid, that we have a difficulty doing it at home, then there's something wrong, right? Because it shouldn't be limited to the masjid. If you have a difficulty, for example, praying your Salatul Layl, if you have a difficulty like reciting certain du'as, now it's the time for actually finding out to evaluate our own discipline and how disciplined we actually are. So I see it as some sort of test and what is it called, a trial, like where the youth, they can actually evaluate their own discipline and spirituality in that sense, right? Because it's not something separate from each other. Spirituality goes back to your discipline and how disciplined you are and actually seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
I see this very, you mentioned the imams. I see this a lot in people's relation to the Aimma. So they grow up and their relation is in the mosque. They go for the birth or the death of the Imam, they go to the mosque. That's their only, like their immediate access to the Imam. They hear the stories from the pulpit. Maybe they read ziyarah together. But the moment they leave for university and relocate or migrate or leave that localized area where they had that relation, it's as if they have to reforge their relation to the Imam. And that happens a lot, I think, in religion generally, but I've seen it a lot with the Ummah. How can we, use the comprehensiveness of the Imam's words? Like the Imams talk about so many issues. How do we reform that relation as the individual, not just the community? Because when we lose the community, maybe we lose that relation.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, we need to fix our understanding and perception of the Imams, alayhi wassalam. Because one of the things that we are neglecting a lot is the social aspect of their lives, like the political and social aspect of their lives, and how they were Imams chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every aspect of their life, like in every situation. It wasn't like only in the masjid that, for example, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, when he was in masjid, he was reciting dua and stuff like that, but when he came out of the masjid, he didn't care about Islam anymore. It wasn't important for him anymore. And I think a lot of people, because they don't understand, they have a tendency to think that Islam is, and of course they compare it to other religions where it's about like simple things as being good, love your neighbor, for example, and these things, and it's not a lifestyle in that sense. Then when they go to the university, they go in different places, they don't take that identity and they put it at home, like they park it at home, and then they go to the university. They have to understand Islam as a lifestyle, so it actually becomes a part of their personality, a part of their identity. So it's not something that can be separated from them. If it's like that, then it's not limited. It's not going to be limited to a masjid. If he doesn't have a masjid, he's going to build one. If he doesn't have a Husayniyah, he's going to build one, right? If there's no congregation, if there's no like community, he's going to build it. He's going to be the first individual that's going to be active and try to like gather the believers in that community. So we have to understand the Imams as individuals who actually give us identity. That's why Imam Khomeini, one of his beautiful speeches, he mentioned that that the Imams, why is it that we perceive them as fathers? Because one of the biggest and most important responsibilities that a father has when it comes to his son or his daughter is that he actually strengthens their identity and he gives them some sort of identity. He gives them roots, right? And that's exactly the same way that the Imam alayhi wasallam, that we should understand the Imam alayhi wasallam as individuals who are giving us an identity, not only in the masjid or in the Husayniyah, but also when it comes to basic things in our daily lives, studying, for example, going to the university, interacting with other individuals. What should it be based on? Because if we don't understand it as a lifestyle, we're going to have a lot of difficulties. And we don't understand how damaging it actually is to understand the Imams in that way. Because then, for example, sins or the amount of sins that you commit, for example, in the universities, in the schools, and so on and so forth, we don't understand the damage they actually do to our spirituality, to our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we become some sort of secular Muslim, where spirituality is only within the masjid or within the Husayniyah, but outside there's no room for it. And that's because we are living this, I don't know, there's no harmony between our heart and our action and our intelligence, like our minds. Because we act in a certain way which goes against what we actually are believing and what we have accepted when it comes to our beliefs and what we actually recite or what we do in the masjid. So it's like contradictive behavior. And because of that, a lot of individuals, they're going to feel like they're going to be stressed, they're going to be depressed, they don't understand, for example. And normally it's the Islamic identity and values they sacrifice for the sake of their worldly affairs, for example. And normally that's what I see amongst a lot of the youth, if they don't actually like do something about it, like their identity and understanding, the perception of the Imam alayhi salam. So unfortunately, especially when it comes to different nationalities that we have in the West, we got a lot of Afghanis, Iranians, Pakistanis, and so on and so forth. So, and they have unfortunately they have a lot of a cultural understanding of Imam alayhi salam. When I say cultural understanding, if you go to the speeches, it's more primarily they're talking about that the Imams were great individuals and so on and so forth. That Imam Ali alayhi salam, he was this individual who's mentioned this many times in the Quran. They're not giving any practical advice for the youth to actually follow Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam by its true meaning, like the character of Imam Ali alayhi salam. They're talking about the passport or the identity of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. His name is Ali ibn Abi Talib, and so on, so forth. But that's not something that's going to benefit the youth. We want to know how Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he interacted with, I don't know, with non-Muslims, how he interacted with Christians, with Jews, for example, how he was in the society, because then you can actually be a follower of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, not only by name, but by action, which is the true meaning of being a Shia, right? So we need to fix our perception of the Imam alayhi salam first, and that's very important that we understand them as they were, not as we would like them to be, like just entertainers in the masjid and then in the Husayniyah, but when we go to the university, please don't follow us, you know, like that identity, we park it, leave it inside the masjid or in the Husayniyah. So that's a very important point when it comes to, what is it called, this whole issue with individuals that normally they're only like religious when it comes to the masjid or the Husayniyah, or when it comes to the university and schools and outside work, they have a difficulty to actually maintaining that spirituality.
Those are some good points.
I bring it to you because I know the issue of overly culture versus the Imams. You can speak at length about this issue. I know, and I've read much of your work on this issue. I'm fascinated to know what you think.
Was that directed at Sheikh?
No, to you, sister.
Oh, really? I think it's complicated. I can completely understand the desire in the modern era to separate quote-unquote culture from authentic Islam, in that we understand there are some practices or worldviews or beliefs that are unhealthy or unjust that have been appended to Islam. And I think we all know what they are. And so when someone says that's not Islam, that's cultural, what they mean is that's wrong and it's not the will of God, basically. I find oftentimes reducing something to the phrase the will of God helps to put it into greater clarity, because honestly some of the things people say are very silly that they ascribe to Islam or they insist on just because it's what they're familiar with and what they know. But I also think that we can't throw away culture. We understand anything through the lens of culture. We all have a culture. Language is part of our culture, the metaphors we use and understand, and any religion ever has been formed and transmitted through cultures and cultural evolution, and Islam is no different. And to some degree, if the Quran had been brought in, say, Japan, perhaps we would have some different nuances in what we consider Islam, not because the message would be different, but things happen over time. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's a value to culture and there's a danger. And what we're looking for is getting rid of the things which are harmful. That's basically the problem. I actually am of the view that a lot of traditions and rituals are things that can actually have a very strong effect in cementing one's identity and also one's relationship with the imams in particular. Because the human being, as we were talking about before, is very holistic and people respond to things differently. And I think this is one area that sometimes we do tend to get a bit wrong in modernity, in that there is such a heavy emphasis sometimes on intellectual teaching. So we lecture the kids, why don't you read Islamic books? Why don't you listen to lectures? Not everyone really gains their full understanding that way. I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. It's a good thing to do. But there's a broader range of the ways we take in and develop our understanding. And people who are very socially minded, for example, are likely going to get more out of large communal programs, or maybe house majalis, or the Arba'in walk, or things where they see this as a human phenomenon and they take that in and they keep it with them. And I think one of the reasons why we do have such a strong emphasis on emotional expression in the Tolver Shi'i tradition is because it basically it engraves things in people much stronger than if we simply said it. I mean, is there a sect of Islam which does not say that Imam Hussein was martyred? You read Tabari, he says it. You read, I don't know, Ibn Athir, I think he says it. And the point being, it's said, but there's a very big difference between saying it and living it and experiencing it internally. And just as when we're talking about the relationship with Allah, we do tend to emphasize, if one's wanting to get into the spiritual discussion, we emphasize the experiential knowledge. You know, like Imam Ali, peace be upon him, what did he say? I would not worship a Lord I could not see. Similarly, when it comes to the Imams, I think that one of the biggest bulwarks against losing one's connection to the values of the Imams in a time of need is having that very deep emotional relationship, because that will kick in at a time of crisis when perhaps a book just in the abstract will not. I work in publications, by the way. I'm not against books, but I'm just saying that there's more. And at the same time, people are all different. And I think this is another area that perhaps as a community we could work into considering, that someone who is very, you know, again, very, very maybe socially minded or a very strong level of emotional intelligence may develop more religiously and spiritually through being engaged in that sort of work, such as charity work or community service work. Someone who is heavily intellectual, they do well at Hausa usually, or they do well in the library. They don't necessarily have to see a lot of people. That's another type. You know, there are people who are more physically minded or materially minded. And there are plenty of avenues to spirituality which aren't in the quote unquote formal mosque arena, such as spending time in nature. You know, is a very common one, and that's very effective for some people. And we can combine all of these things. You know, I mean, it's been a while since I've seen it done, but I remember going to a couple youth retreats in the mountains. So you all get out and pray under the sky, and you're looking at the mountains, and it's very beautiful, and it's very different to how a lot of us live in this day and age. So my point is, there's multiple routes, and I personally, you know, but going back to the culture issue, I don't really advocate trying to throw away culture. What that oftentimes becomes is simply replacing one culture with another one. But I think it's good to take a balanced view and really highlight the main issue, which is justice, and are certain views harmful or unjust? And if so, then we shouldn't be speaking them in the name of God or in the name of Ahlulbayt.
Sheikh, do you take the youth to look at the mountains in Denmark? It's a perfect place for it, I would think.
We don't have any mountains in Denmark. We only have green hills, so we have no mountain. It's a flat earth, so.
Those are nice too.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Like that, you know, we actually take them out for a lot of trips. Like every month, we have 2 trips outside of the masjid for the youth, and it's something that we made obligatory. Sometimes it's going out in the nature, sometimes it's paintball, sometimes it's go-kart. It's different, right? But just to strengthen like the bond between the youth. But sometimes we have spiritual programs outside of the masjid as well. We read Dua Kumayt, for example, in the forest, go out and have a barbecue or something like that. So I definitely agree on that. And like the whole concept of filtering like the different bad parts of the culture outside, and then take the good parts of the culture. Of course, that's very important as well, because without a culture, it's going to be difficult to have any identity, and then you're going to seek an identity in other cultures and values, and you're not guaranteed that they're going to be as Islamic as the culture you actually have from back home. So that's a very good point, because sometimes when I speak, it can sound like I'm anti-culture, but I'm not anti-culture. I just think that there's some elements within different cultures that we need to focus on, so they don't, what is it called, divert the message of Islam to an extent where the message is being forgotten. Like the imams are being the purpose of what is it called, of the creation and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because sometimes it actually gets to that extent where like it's only about sitting on the minbar and talking great about individuals and not so much about how we can actually follow the example of these individuals. So we don't understand the function of the imam because certain cultural elements within different cultures. So but
one might proffer that from a, oh, sorry, did I interrupt? If that's not haram, that's certainly not good. One might proffer that in a very deep or deeper sense, no one can really fully understand the imams. We only get to levels.
I know where you're going with the sister, but you can't go too deep. But you have to explain a little bit more.
Well, I mean, if you look at the position of the Prophet and the Imams before Allah in the context of what we have narrated in our tradition, you know, like Al-Kafi and similar books, they do have a very strong presence in the world beyond what we see, which is beyond beyond what most people, including myself, are ever going to understand. I'm not going to rule out every single person, but in general, of course, if we limit understanding to the imams, like Imam Ali said, to tell the truth. And by the way, I'm not being facetious, and I'm not talking down to you. I don't mean this like as a personal attack, but I'm just saying that maybe sometimes this isn't emphasized. We do sometimes limit the teachings of the imams to things like be nice to people, be good to your neighbor, which we can mostly get without the imams. You can go to a lot of people and be told the same things. But those are stepping stones, and they are important. And I would say, by and large, if I may start up soapbox time here, one of the things that I have unfortunately consistently seen over the years, if we are talking about the youth, is that there doesn't always seem to be a transfer of what I would consider to be the most important authentic Islamic values to the youth, or even the adults, let's be honest. It's not only youth. And I think the most important of those is an absolute sense of Tawheed, in the sense of servitude to God combined with freedom from the rest of the creation. Sorry, which is an ideal. I'm not there, certainly. I've got all sorts of entanglements and people who I consider to have power over me and things that I'm afraid of and hoops that I jump through and so forth. But that is the ideal. You don't see the Prophet, for example, being afraid of human beings, whether it's socially or in terms of his safety and so forth. So that's a number one value from which everything else stems. I think if you get that, you get justice down, in an absolute sense. I mean, combined with compassion, of course. I'm not talking about the sort of justice where we attack people for every infraction, but avoiding injustice, perhaps, is a better way of phrasing it, and a few other key values, then the other things will tend to fall in place. And yet sometimes, I find like a lot of our religious discussions these days are actually very focused directly or indirectly on the topic of identity. It can be sometimes we're pinpointing certain sectarian issues and talking about them as if we care about them because they're so important, but the only reason we really care is because they're sectarian issues, like how to do wudu. Now, I'm not saying it's not important, by the way, don't misquote me, but I'm saying I've never seen a passionate speech on why we do ruku in prayer. You know, most Muslims will agree on that. But there are a lot of passionate speeches about why you do wudu one way or the other because it is an identity issue. And there are certain historical issues that are identity issues, which have a place. Identity is important, but it's not the limit. And I think at some point, young people check out from that. And they say, okay, well, I've got Khadir home. I've got, the basic idea of imamate. If they've been following these things, what comes next? And there isn't always something that is provided that comes next. So there are things above identity issues, even though identity is important. And I just wanted to kind of drop in here too, since you guys, or sorry, that was rude, but you both have been discussing identity issues, that if we are talking about the youth, and by and large, at this point in life, I do not think youth are the only quote unquote problem area. I think actually we've got an enormous gap in the middle-aged area of people whose needs are not being served. But if you're talking about, say, from about 14 to 22 or 23, you've got some basic life changes there, or life issues, and identity formation is a critical thing there that's going on. Starting to think for yourself and question the views you were brought up with is something that goes on. And if we're talking about relationships with the imams, probably figuring out what is your relationship with the imam, or what is your relationship with Allah, is going to be going on too. The peer group is very important then. And these things, they take time to go through, but they have a phase. Usually for most people, they finish up. I mean, they might resurface throughout life, but that's what goes on at that age. So what you're talking about is to some degree part and parcel of what happens to people naturally at that age. And spiritual growth for most people also has a, what do you call it, an evolution or a trend. I mean, Muslims are not the only people to identify the age of 40 as sort of an age of spiritual awakening and spiritual maturity. It's not to say it can't happen before that, or doesn't always happen at that age. But the point is, in our younger years, we're oftentimes on a growth trajectory, or we're basically primed to have other priorities, which might not be focusing on what we might call spirituality, or rather the spirituality might be expressed through other things, especially having and raising children. I mean, it's a very spiritual thing, but in and of itself, the act of creation is, after all, what Allah does, and the act of looking after people and raising people is what Allah does. But that's a different sort of spiritual act than sitting and contemplating in silence, which people don't tend to do when they have 3-year-olds running around. So what I'm saying is there's a life trajectory, and the peer group, the identity, the questioning, figuring things out, that is basically what you do as a young person. So it's good to be there and support it, but also acknowledge it has its place, and there's other things that have their place.
Yeah, a really good example of that difference is, I think, the relationship someone has to Abu Abdullah, to Imam al-Hussein. So that often people are very attached to mourning for Imam al-Hussein, which is of course a beautiful thing, or the external manifestations of Imam al-Hussein. But what about his servitude to God and his, his freedom, like the interior, which is not always accessible? And you're right, it's a trajectory. Like as you grow, your relationship becomes more and more deeper and more intimate. And the hope is a person keeps moving forward in that relationship. Sheikh, I think for me this helps. For you, do we see Imam al-Hussein being used in this, directly relevant to your spiritual life in the way that the sister was alluding towards?
That's a difficult question. When it comes to human beings, we don't have access to the hearts of human beings except through our actions, right? So shedding tears for Abu Abdullah, it's limited how much it actually has an effect on an individual. I'm not saying it doesn't have an effect. The emotional bond that you create to Abu Abdullah is very important, because one of the aspects of human beings is emotions, right? We are emotional by creation, and that's completely normal and it's natural. So therefore, we need to take care of that need that we actually have and create that emotional bond. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains it in the Holy Quran as well, that He hasn't created two hearts for a man. Like, you only have one heart. You can only get attached to one certain thing. If it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, then it's a positive thing. But if it's not that, it's going to be something else, which maybe not be as positive or even like beneficial for you as the love that you can have for Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. So I think that the emotional bond for Abu Abdullah alayhi salam is very important. But if you don't follow up on it in action and understand Abu Abdullah alayhi salam as a lifestyle, it's going to cause some issues and some conflicts. And it's not going to guarantee that you're actually going to continue having that emotional bond to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. What protects the emotional bond to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam is that you actually try your best. Of course, I'm not saying that you can follow him or be like him completely, but just the fact that you can be, maybe your perfection is 1% of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. Different people have different capacities, right? But just as you're trying to follow up Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, you are actually guaranteeing or protecting and preserving that emotional bond that you have to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. So I think that's a very important point that to mention, because a lot of people, they think it's about shedding tears, or it's about No, sometimes you have to follow up or protect that emotional bond. The emotional bond is not always there. You have to protect it, and you protect it through action. Protect it by actually following the person, understanding and implementing the values that he stood for. And that's the whole concept of seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. You create that emotional bond and you follow up on that emotional bond, and you try to implement the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except for one attribute, which is mutakabbir. You try to implement the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your own existence, right? By trying to look at the attributes of Allah and trying to acting upon the attributes of Allah when it comes to the creations or your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which creates that bond, emotional bond as well, and strengthen your spirituality or that spiritual journey that you have towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the greatest means to actually have that is Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, because that's emotional bond is already there. Even though if you're a person that you sin a lot, if you have committed a lot of sins throughout your day, like, even for the most hopeless person, sometimes when it comes to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, he doesn't have a difficulty shedding tears. When it comes to his prayers, he have a difficulty shedding tears, for example, creating that emotional bond. When it comes to dua, he has a difficulty shedding tears. But when it comes to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, it's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created him as a mean to have that emotional bond to him, as a bridge between like the creations and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that emotional bridge that should exist, which we don't have in a lot of actions throughout our lives. For example, like the different ibadat we have within Islam. But it's something else when it comes to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, and that's a beautiful part of it. But it's, of course, there's some conditions. One of the conditions for us to have that or preserve that emotional bond is that we actually try our best to follow up on it. So that's an important point that we have to emphasize a lot on when it comes to the community, especially the people in the West, right? When they have to understand Islam as a lifestyle and Abu Abdullah alayhi salam as a lifestyle. Because our scholars, when they talk about Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, they say that he's a school of thought. He's not only one person, he's a school of thought. There's so many things that you can learn from Abu Abdullah alayhi salam and what happened in Karbala, which makes it a school of thought and an ideology for itself to how to seek closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
My heart is telling me we need to discuss this further, but my mind is telling me it's been 1 hour and we're coming to the end of the discussion. And so, sister, if you allow that to be the final word, and if we may end, we really hope that the listeners ponder on this point in particular and the general nuances of spirituality, inshallah. Thank you both of you so much for taking part in this discussion. It was a pleasure for me and for the listener, inshallah. If we could end together on a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So there we have it. The spiritual path of Ahlulbayt is one which is about recognizing God, ma'rifah. But in order to get there, we have to navigate a number of potential obstructions, which could come in the form of our society, this material world, our existing biases coming from our culture, or our own biases against culture. We have to work with the resources which we have in order to make and fashion for ourselves a lifestyle which has within it each step which is coming from the religion, which takes us towards God. Every action before and after, for example, our prayer, helps us and prepares us for that prayer, and that prayer takes us towards God. We hope and pray, the listeners, all of you and myself, that we can actually live this and make sure that we are practically following a thing which attains a victory which we are all seeking, which is, of course, the nearness to God. Thank you for listening, and we will see you soon, inshallah.